The cellar is cold even before winter arrives. Somewhere above, the sounds of distant artillery roll like thunder, dull and irregular, but down here the air is still. A single bulb hangs from a wire, casting light over shelves made from scrap wood. Glass jars line the walls. Cloth sacks sit stacked in corners. Nothing here looks dramatic, but everything here matters. For the family living above this cellar, these shelves are not preparation. They are survival already in progress. When war came to Europe, it did not arrive all at once. It crept in through ration cards, empty shops, and trains that no longer ran on time. At first, families assumed shortages would pass. Then weeks turned into months, and months into years. By the time many realized how long the war would last, the only food that mattered was the food already stored. One of the most common items hidden away was dried grain. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats were cleaned, dried, and sealed in cloth sacks or metal containers. Grain could survive years if kept dry, and it could be transformed into bread, porridge, or thick soups. Families understood that grain was not a meal by itself, but it was a foundation. Even when fuel was scarce and ovens went cold, grain could be soaked, boiled, or ground by hand. It was heavy, unremarkable, and essential. Beside the grain were sacks of dried legumes, beans, lentils, peas. These were foods chosen for patience. They took time to cook, time to soften, and time to digest, but they provided strength when meat disappeared entirely. In occupied regions, legumes replaced protein that ration systems could no longer supply. Families learned to soak them overnight, stretching precious fuel by reducing cooking time. A pot of beans could feed a household for days, especially when mixed with grain or vegetables pulled from frozen ground. Salted meat was, another pillar of long-term survival. Pork, beef, and sometimes fish were preserved using salt whenever fresh meat was still available. These cuts weren't eaten quickly. Instead, they were hung, wrapped, or stored in barrels, with their moisture slowly drawn out. Over time, salted meat became tougher, but it just didn't rot. During the worst periods of scarcity, only small portions were shaved into soups or stews, mostly for flavor rather than fullness. Even just a few grams of salted fat could turn a thin broth into something more sustaining. Lard and rendered animal fat, those were guarded carefully. Fat was energy, warmth, and endurance, all in physical form. Families rendered fat during slaughter seasons, pouring it into jars or crocks and sealing it away from air. In winter, fat could harden like stone, but it still remained usable. Just a spoonful could be added to bread dough, vegetables, or porridge. In places where hunger was always present, fat was sometimes traded ounce by ounce, and honestly, it was worth more than sugar or flour. Sugar itself was, if you could get it, another long-term stockpile. It preserved fruit, helped extend shelf life, and provided quick energy when rations ran out. Families used sugar to make jams and preserves during harvest seasons, sealing fruit into jars that could last for years if left unopened. These preserves weren't treats during wartime. They were winter food. Even a small spoonful could help prevent weakness, especially among children and the elderly. Root vegetables formed a quiet backbone of survival. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, and beets were stored in cellars, pits, or sometimes just buried under straw and earth. When kept cool and dark, these vegetables could last through entire winters. Potatoes, in particular, became a staple where grain was scarce. They could be boiled, baked, or mashed, and even when partially spoiled, families salvaged what they could. The cellar was checked constantly, and spoiled roots were removed before they infected the rest. Cabbage was preserved through fermentation. Sauerkraut and similar fermented vegetables were common across Central and Eastern Europe. Cabbage was cheap, resilient, and easy to grow even under poor conditions. Once fermented, it could last months or even longer, providing not only calories, but nutrients that prevented illness. In winter, when fresh food vanished, Fermented cabbage was often the only source of vital sustenance. Dried bread was never thrown away. Stale loaves were sliced, dried, and stored. These hard pieces could be soaked in water or broth, grated into flour, or eaten slowly to stretch meals. In some households, bread was dried intentionally, baked harder than usual so it would survive longer. Nothing was wasted. Bread was counted, measured, and guarded. Powdered milk, showed up in households that had access to aid supplies or maybe some rural connections. It didn't spoil quickly and could be mixed with water to feed children when, fresh milk just disappeared. Even when it was hard to find, families would ration powdered milk, carefully saving it for times of illness, pregnancy, or honestly, just extreme hunger. It wasn't exactly pleasant, but it was reliable. Canned foods. They really became symbols of security. Vegetables, meat, and fish sealed up in metal could last for years as long as the cans weren't damaged. Most families didn't use their cans for daily meals, but saved them for real emergencies, like emergencies within emergencies. If bombing destroyed the markets or supply convoys didn't make it, a single can might mean survival for another week. And the sound of a can opening was often saved for the very worst days. Dried fruit was another kind of quiet reserve. Apples, plums, berries, and pears would be sliced and dried during the harvest seasons. Sometimes they were hung near stoves or just laid out in the sun, losing moisture but keeping flavor and energy. People ate them sparingly, maybe added to bread or porridge, or soaked them to make thin compotes. Even small amounts, honestly, could lift morale during those long winters. Coffee substitutes were stored not for nutrition but, for routine. Roasted barley, chicory, or even acorns replaced coffee when imports vanished. These drinks, they offered a bit of familiarity when everything else changed. Maintaining routine was, honestly, a form of survival in itself. Honey, when it was available, was truly treasured. It never spoiled and required no processing at all. Used sparingly, it sweetened food and, soothed illness. In rural areas, beekeeping continued even during war, providing one of the few renewable sweeteners. Dried fish, especially in coastal and northern regions, remained a dependable protein source. Salted and dried, it could survive long storage and be rehydrated when needed. Like salted meat, it was, more often than not, used in small portions to flavor larger meals. Flour was stored whenever possible, but it, required protection from moisture and pests. Families learned to rotate flour supplies, always using the older stock first. And when flour ran low, bread became thinner, darker, and was mixed with other ingredients to stretch it further. Finally, seeds were stored not as food, but really as future survival. Families understood that war might outlast their current supplies. Seeds meant gardens, and gardens meant independence from failing systems. Even during hunger, some seeds were never eaten. Together, these foods formed a system, not just a pantry. Survival was not about abundance, but about balance. Families measured meals not by satisfaction, but by endurance. The war did not end hunger quickly. Even after the fighting stopped, shortages continued. Those who survived the longest were often the ones who had stored quietly, patiently, and without any certainty that it would ever be enough. Many of these foods still exist today, unchanged in principle. They remind us that survival is, rarely dramatic. It happens in cellars, in jars, in careful choices made long before crisis arrives. In wartime, the future belonged not to those who hoped for rescue, but to those who prepared for absence.